Dust choked the Texas wind the day Josephine stepped off the locomotive, clutching a carpet bag weighing far more than her delicate frame suggested. Nobody expected this frail-looking mail-order bride to harbor a dangerous secret, nor did anyone guess the strange steel tools in her trunk would rescue a ruined man. The drought of 1888 had turned the Broken Spur Ranch into a graveyard of shattered dreams and sun-bleached bones. Silas Montgomery stood on the porch of his weather-beaten homestead, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face was lined with a premature harshness. At 34, Silas had poured his blood, sweat, and the last of his family's savings into the sprawling Texas acreage. For a time, it had thrived. But then the rain stopped, and more devastatingly, Thaddeus Boone arrived. Boone was a merciless land baron from Chicago who had bought up the territory north of the Broken Spur. Utilizing a crooked judge and a loophole in the state water rights, Boone had dammed the Sweetwater Creek, strangling Silas's land of its only reliable life source. Without water, Silas's cattle were dropping by the dozen. Foreclosure loomed over his head like a vulture. Boone held the mortgage, and he was scheduled to collect in exactly 3 days. Silas was a desperate man, and desperate men make blind wagers. 3 months prior, knowing he needed a partner to help maintain the homestead while he desperately scoured the dry riverbeds for unmapped springs, Silas had written to the Continental Matrimonial Agency in St. Louis. He hadn't asked for beauty or romance. He had explicitly requested a woman of strong pioneer stock, a widow of a farmer, perhaps, someone who knew how to slop pigs, mend fences, and survive on beans and grit. The woman who stepped off the Union Pacific train in Oak Haven was none of those things. Silas watched from the buckboard wagon, his heart sinking into his dusty boots. Josephine Caldwell looked entirely out of place amidst the rough timber and dirt streets of the frontier town. She was striking, with sharp, intelligent dark eyes and a mess of auburn hair pinned meticulously beneath a modest traveling hat, but she possessed the refined posture of an Eastern aristocrat. Her dress, though faded and worn at the hems, was tailored wool. Her hands were gloved in silk. "Mr. Montgomery?" she asked, her voice steady and melodious, cutting through the clamor of the busy platform. Silas tipped his Stetson, his jaw taut. "That's me. You're Josephine?" "I am. You may call me Josie," she replied, offering a polite nod but extending no hand. Silas looked past her to the platform where a sweating porter was wrestling with her luggage. Silas had expected a single trunk containing linens and a few dresses. Instead, the porter was struggling with 4 massive, iron-bound chests that looked heavy enough to crack the wooden floorboards. "What in God's name do you have in there, Miss Caldwell? An anvil collection?" Silas asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Josie's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of steel behind her polite facade. "Family heirlooms, Mr. Montgomery, and I must insist they be handled with the utmost care. They are fragile." Silas sighed, rubbing the back of his sun-scorched neck. He helped the porter heave the monstrous trunks into the back of the wagon. The wagon's springs groaned under the immense weight. As they rode out of Oak Haven, the silence between them was thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the wooden wheels grinding over baked earth. "I'll be frank with you, Josie," Silas finally said, staring straight ahead at the shimmering heat mirages. "You don't look like a woman who's ever shoveled manure or butchered a hog. I wrote to that agency asking for a farmhand and a skirt. I'm standing on the edge of ruin. I don't have the time or the money to entertain a city lady." Josie kept her gaze fixed on the desolate landscape passing them by. Your letters mentioned a thriving cattle operation, Mr. Montgomery. Yet, from the looks of those carcasses we just passed, your ranch is dying. It seems we both omitted certain truths in our correspondence." Silas clenched his jaw. She was right. He hadn't mentioned Boone or the dam. "The land dried up. A neighbor choked my water supply. Boone takes the deed in 3 days if I don't pay out my loan, which I can't do because my herd is too weak to drive to the railhead." "Then it appears," Josie said softly, her eyes scanning the topography of the rolling, parched hills with an odd, intense scrutiny, "that we both have 3 days to secure our futures." When they arrived at the broken spur, the reality of Silas's destitution became fully apparent. The house was drafty, the paint peeling like a bad sunburn. Silas's only remaining hands, a grizzled old-timer named Coot and a teenage runaway named Billy, stared at the new bride with unabashed skepticism. That evening, Josie's attempts to help with supper proved disastrous. She nearly burned the kitchen down attempting to use the cast-iron wood stove, and the coffee she brewed tasted distinctly like alkaline mud. Silas ate in grim silence, his resentment building. He had sent his last $50 to the agency for a savior, and instead he had imported a burden. He decided he would put her back on the train on Monday, right after Boone took the ranch. He left her in the house and went to sleep on a cot in the tack room, preferring the smell of leather and horse sweat to the quiet shame of his failure. The next morning brought no reprieve from the blazing Texas sun, nor from Silas's mounting dread. He was out by the dry creek bed, hacking fruitlessly at the cracked mud with a pickaxe, praying for a seep of moisture when the thundering sound of approaching horses caught his attention. Thaddeus Boone rode onto the broken spur flanked by 3 hired guns. Boone was a fleshy man who wore expensive broadcloth suits that held the stench of cheap cologne and cigars. He looked down at Silas from his silver-saddled roan, a smug smile plastered across his face. "Dig in your own grave, Montgomery," Boone sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the dry earth. "You're trespassing, Boone," Silas growled, leaning heavily on the handle of his pickaxe, his knuckles white. "Just taking an early inventory of my property," Boone replied, his greedy eyes scanning the homestead. His gaze suddenly stopped, locking onto the porch where Josie had emerged, wiping flour from her hands with an apron. Boone's smile widened into something predatory. "Well now, I didn't know the property came with such delightful fixtures. A bit refined for a dirt scratcher like you, Silas." "Keep your eyes off my wife," Silas warned, stepping between Boone's line of sight and the house. Boone chuckled, gathering his reins. "Tomorrow at noon, Montgomery. The bank manager's riding out with the sheriff. Have your bags packed and the deed ready. Unless you somehow manifest $2,000 in gold from the sky, this dirt is mine. Maybe the little lady will decide she prefers a man who can actually afford to feed her." Boone and his men rode off, leaving a cloud of choking dust in their wake. Silas stood trembling with rage and impotence. He walked back to the house, avoiding Josie's questioning gaze, and told Coot and Billy to start packing their meager belongings. It was over. Night fell over the Texas plains, bringing a chilling breeze that offered little comfort. Silas lay on his cot in the tack room, staring at the wooden beams, unable to sleep. Around midnight, a strange, rhythmic, metallic clicking sound drifted across the yard, accompanied by a faint, acrid smell that stung his nostrils, like sulfur mixed with sharp vinegar. Frowning, Silas swung his legs off the cot. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from the corner, checking the chamber in the dark. The sound was coming from the main barn. Silas crept across the moonlit dirt, keeping to the shadows. The large barn doors were pulled shut, but a sliver of golden lantern light spilled through the crack. He raised his rifle, pressed his boot against the timber, and kicked the door open. "Don't move," Silas shouted, leveling the barrel into the barn. He froze. Josie was standing in the center of the barn, illuminated by 2 kerosene lanterns. But she was not wearing her modest nightgown. She wore a pair of men's canvas trousers and a heavy leather apron. Her 4 massive, iron-bound trunks were thrown wide open. They did not contain dresses or family china. The trunks were packed with gleaming brass instruments, calipers, tripods, an intricate theodolite, rolled-up geological maps covered in complex mathematical equations, and row upon row of glass vials filled with strange colored liquids. In her gloved hands, Josie was carefully threading a thick cotton fuse into a waxy, cylindrical stick of dynamite. Dozens of similar sticks were stacked meticulously in a wooden crate lined with sawdust. "Good heavens, Mr. Montgomery! Lower that firearm before you blow us both to kingdom come," Josie hissed, her eyes wide as she carefully set the explosive down on a barrel. Silas slowly lowered the rifle, his mouth agape. He looked from the dynamite to the brass surveying scopes, and finally to his mail-order bride. "What in the hell are you doing? Who are you?" Josie wiped her brow with the back of her leather-clad wrist. She took a deep, steadying breath. "I told you I possessed family heirlooms. I simply neglected to mention that my father was Ezekiel Caldwell." Silas shook his head, thoroughly bewildered. The railroad engineer? Everyone had heard of Caldwell. He was a legend who had blasted train tunnels through the impenetrable Rocky Mountains, until a massive bridge collapse a year ago had disgraced him and sent him to an early grave. "Yes," Josie said, her voice tightening with a mixture of pride and lingering grief. "The world thought my father worked alone. They didn't know he had a daughter who had been apprenticing under him, calculating load-bearing pressures and subterranean hydrology since she was 12. The bridge collapse wasn't his fault. It was corporate sabotage by a rival magnate. But he took the blame, and it killed him. I was blacklisted, hunted by the men who stole his patents. I needed a place where no one would ever look for Ezekiel Caldwell's protege. A dying ranch in the middle of nowhere seemed perfect." Silas stared at her. The frail city girl vanished, replaced by a woman of undeniable intellect and dangerous capability. "So you brought enough explosives to level the county, and you're out here in my barn building bombs?" "I am not building bombs, Silas. I'm engineering salvation," Josie said, stepping over to a large wooden drafting board she had hastily assembled over hay bales. She tapped a graphite pencil against a heavily marked topographical map of the broken spur. "While you were arguing with Mr. Boone today, I took the liberty of hiking up the ridge with my transit level," she explained, her voice quickening with excitement. "Boone didn't just dam a surface creek. He built his reservoir directly over a primary fault line. I recognized the geological markers, limestone outcroppings, specific sinkhole patterns, the way the flora roots structure themselves. Boone thinks he's hoarding your water up north. He isn't. The water pressure from his dam is being forced down into a subterranean aquifer, a massive underground river." She looked up, her dark eyes flashing in the lantern light. "And that aquifer runs directly beneath our boots, right under the broken spur." Silas felt a tremor in his chest. "Underground? How deep?" "Deep," Josie confirmed. "Trapped beneath a thick capstone of impermeable shale. Digging wouldn't reach it in a year. But," She gestured to the crates of dynamite and the vials of highly unstable nitroglycerin. "If we fracture the shale cap at the exact point of maximum hydrostatic pressure, the water won't just seep out. It will erupt. We can create an artesian well that will flood your dry creek bed and bypass Boone's Dam entirely." Silas looked at the map, then at the explosives, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You want to blow up my pasture in the middle of the night?" "I want to save this ranch overnight," Josie corrected him, stepping closer. The scent of sulfur and sweet lavender soap clung to her. "But my calculations show the fracture point is on the far north edge of your property, dangerously close to Boone's boundary line. We have a window of about 5 hours before dawn. If I am wrong, we blow a crater in the dirt, and Boone takes the land tomorrow. If I am right—" "If you're right," Silas breathed, finishing her thought. "Boone's Dam loses its pressure, his reservoir drains into my land, and I have the richest, most permanent water source in the territory." Josie nodded slowly. "Are you a gambling man, Mr. Montgomery?" Silas looked at the woman he had intended to send away. He saw the grease on her cheek, the fierce, unyielding intelligence in her eyes, and the sheer audacity of her plan. A slow, reckless smile spread across his hardened face for the first time in a year. "Josie," Silas said, racking the lever of his Winchester, "load the wagon." The broken spur wagon crept over the moonlit prairie, its rusted axles groaning in protest under the weight of high-grade DuPont dynamite and crates of intricate surveying equipment. Silas drove the team of mules with agonizing slowness, his eyes scanning the horizon for the silhouettes of Thaddeus Boone's night riders. Beside him sat Josie, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders to ward off the biting chill, her gloved hands resting protectively atop a padded wooden box containing vials of Nobel's blasting gelatin, a highly volatile liquid nitroglycerin mixture she had synthesized herself. In the back of the wagon, Coot and Billy sat in terrified silence. They had spent their lives roping calves and branding hides. Riding shotgun with enough ordnance to level a mountain peak was outside their wheelhouse. "How far to the fracture line?" Silas whispered, the wind snatching the words from his lips. Josie consulted a hand-drawn map illuminated by the faint glow of a hooded lantern. "Half a mile. It's a depression near the northern boundary line, right before the terrain elevates toward Boone's property. Geologically, it's an ancient limestone sinkhole filled with sedimentary rock. That is where the Trinity Aquifer's shale cap is thinnest." They reached the designated spot shortly after 1 a.m. It was a desolate, shallow ravine choked with dead mesquite bushes and cracked, unforgiving hardpan. The sheer magnitude of the silence made the task feel all the more perilous. Every clink of metal, every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Josie sprang into action, moving with a practiced, mathematical precision that left Silas in awe. She set up her brass theodolite on its wooden tripod, squinting through the lens to align her position with the North Star and a distant granite outcropping. After 10 minutes of feverish calculations on a slate board, she drove a wooden stake into the center of the ravine. "Here," Josie declared, her breath pluming in the cold air. "We need 3 boreholes, angled at exactly 45 degrees, converging at a depth of 6 feet. The bedrock here is solid limestone. We must drill." Silas, Coot, and Billy retrieved the heavy iron star drills and 10-pound sledgehammers from the wagon. For the next 2 hours, the ravine echoed with the rhythmic, agonizing clink-thwack of steel driving into stone. Sweat poured down Silas's face, stinging his eyes and mixing with the alkaline dust. His muscles screamed in protest, fueled only by the sheer desperate hope that this city woman knew what she was doing. Suddenly, Billy dropped his hammer. "Riders," the boy hissed, pointing toward the ridgeline. Silas's blood ran cold. Two silhouettes on horseback were cresting the hill, holding torches that cast long, ominous shadows over the brush. Boone's men on patrol. "Keep quiet," Silas ordered, drawing his Winchester from the wagon bed. "Josie, hide the lanterns. Coot, Billy, get down in the brush." "Silas, the boreholes are ready," Josie whispered urgently, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "I need to set the charges now, or we lose our window." "Do it," Silas said, racking around into the chamber. "I'll buy you the time." Silas crept out of the ravine, moving swiftly through the dense chaparral to intercept the riders before they could spot the wagon. As they drew nearer, Silas recognized the lead rider, a notoriously vicious hired gun named Tex Corbett. "Hold it right there, Corbett," Silas called out, stepping from the shadows, his rifle leveled at the man's chest. Corbett reined in his horse, his hand hovering near his Colt revolver. "Montgomery, what the hell are you doing out here in the dirt at 3 a.m? Tomorrow's moving day for you, ain't it?" "Looking for a stray calf," Silas lied smoothly, keeping his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "You're pushing close to my boundary line, Tex. I suggest you turn around." Down in the ravine, hidden by the lip of the depression, Josie was working with terrifying speed. She slid the cylindrical sticks of DuPont dynamite down into the boreholes, packing them tight with clay. But she knew the dynamite alone wouldn't fracture the deep shale cap. She needed a shaped charge to direct the explosive force straight down into the earth. With trembling fingers, she opened the padded box and withdrew a glass vial of the blasting gelatin. She knew all too well the devastating power of the liquid. It was this exact chemical compound that had drawn the ruthless Pinkerton agents, hired by the corrupt railroad magnate Collis P. Huntington, to raid her father's laboratory in St. Louis. They had wanted the proprietary formula. Josie had fled with it, burying her identity beneath a mail-order bride advertisement. She poured the gelatine into the center junction of the boreholes, attached the blasting caps, and spooled out a long length of waxed fuse wire, unraveling it as she scrambled up the side of the ravine. Up above, Corbett was sneering at Silas. "Ain't no calves out here, Montgomery. But I do smell something. Smells like sulfur." Corbett spurred his horse forward, attempting to push past Silas. Silas didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot directly into the dirt, inches from the horse's hooves. The animal reared wildly, nearly throwing Corbett from the saddle. "Next one takes your hat off, Tex," Silas roared. Before Corbett could draw his weapon, a voice rang out from the darkness behind Silas. "Fire in the hole," Josie screamed. "Move," Silas yelled, diving backward into the scrub brush. A split second later, the earth beneath them ceased to be solid. The explosion did not sound like a gunshot or a cannon. It sounded as though the very tectonic plates of the earth were tearing apart. A blinding flash of yellow-white light turned the midnight prairie into stark daylight for a fraction of a second, followed by a concussive shock wave that knocked Silas flat on his back, stealing the breath from his lungs. A massive pillar of pulverized limestone, dirt, and fire erupted from the ravine, rocketing 50 feet into the night sky. The ground heaved, undulating like a stormy sea. Corbett and his companion, their horses panicked beyond control, were thrown to the ground before scrambling up and fleeing blindly back toward Boone's ranch, convinced the gateway to hell had just been blown open. Debris rained down across the prairie, clattering against the wagon and shattering the dry brush. Then silence fell, a heavy, ringing silence. Silas pushed himself up, his ears ringing violently. He stumbled through the settling dust toward the wagon, coughing and waving his hands. "Josie! Coot! Billy! We're here!" Coot yelled, pulling himself out from under the wagon bed, dragging a wide-eyed Billy with him. Silas found Josie leaning against a boulder, her face covered in soot, but her eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. They rushed to the edge of the ravine. The crater was massive, a jagged black scar in the earth, but it was completely dry. Dust swirled lazily in the basin. Nothing else. Silas felt the bottom fall out of his stomach. The desperate gamble had failed. They had blown a hole in the dirt, alerted Boone, and wasted their final hours. He looked at Josie, expecting to see defeat, but she was staring intently at the bottom of the crater, her head tilted. "Wait," she whispered. A deep, subterranean rumble vibrated through the soles of Silas's boots. It wasn't the echo of the blast. It was something structural, something moving. Suddenly, the cracked bedrock at the center of the crater buckled upward. A geyser of muddy brown sludge shot into the air, followed by a deafening roar of escaping atmospheric pressure. Then came the water. It erupted with the fury of a caged beast, a massive, roaring column of crystal-clear, ice-cold water rocketing 20 feet into the air. The pressure from the underground Trinity Aquifer, suppressed for centuries and newly swollen by Boone's illegal damming, had finally found its release. The water crashed down into the crater, rapidly filling the basin before spilling over the jagged lip. It rushed down the natural decline of the landscape, surging into the long-dead trenches of Sweetwater Creek. Silas watched in sheer disbelief as the bone-dry riverbed transformed into a raging, life-giving artery within minutes. "You did it," Silas breathed, pulling off his hat, the icy spray washing the dirt from his face. "By God, Josie, you actually did it." Josie allowed a weary, triumphant smile to break through the soot on her face. "Science, Mr. Montgomery. It rarely lies." By 10 o'clock the next morning, the sun was beating down on a radically transformed Broken Spur ranch. The Sweetwater Creek was flowing faster and deeper than Silas had ever seen it. His emaciated cattle were lined up along the muddy banks, drinking greedily from the cold, fast-moving current. Right on time, the sound of approaching horses signaled the arrival of the executioners. Thaddeus Boone rode into the yard, flanked by his hired guns, accompanied by Sheriff Amos Walker and Horace Pendleton, the portly manager of the Oak Haven Bank. Boone wore a triumphant smirk, holding a leather satchel containing the foreclosure documents. But as they rode closer to the homestead, the smirk faltered. The sound of rushing water was unmistakable. Boone yanked his roan to a halt, his eyes bulging as he stared at the overflowing creek. "What is this? Where did this water come from?" Silas stood on the porch, leaning casually against the railing. Beside him stood Josie, dressed not in her men's trousers but in her tailored wool dress, looking every bit the refined Eastern lady, save for a smudge of stubborn grease on her collar. "Mornin', Sheriff Walker, Mr. Pendleton," Silas called out warmly. "Thaddeus, you're a bit early." "Montgomery, you stole my water," Boone roared, his face turning an apoplectic shade of purple. He turned to the lawman. "Sheriff, arrest this man. He dynamited my dam in the night. My reservoir is draining backward as we speak." Sheriff Walker, a pragmatic man with a thick silver mustache, tipped his hat back and looked at the roaring creek. "I don't see no broken dam, Boone. I see a man with a mighty healthy spring on his property." Josie stepped forward, descending the porch stairs with a bundle of rolled parchment in her hands. She unfurled them atop a rain barrel, revealing complex geological cross-sections and official state patents. "Mr. Boone is partially correct, Sheriff," Josie said clearly, her voice carrying the undeniable authority of Ezekiel Caldwell's daughter. "His surface reservoir is indeed draining, but not because we touched his dam. We tapped into the Trinity Aquifer directly beneath the broken spur. Because Mr. Boone dammed the surface water, the hydrostatic pressure forced the water table downward. By opening an artesian well on our side of the property line, the water is simply following the path of least resistance." She tapped a manicured finger on a legal document stamped with the seal of the state of Texas. "Under the English common law of absolute ownership, which governs groundwater in this state, the subterranean water beneath this soil belongs entirely to the surface owner. We haven't stolen a drop. We are simply retrieving what is legally ours." Pendleton, the bank manager, adjusted his spectacles, examining the documents and then looking at the rushing water. He smiled thinly. "Well, Silas, it appears your property value just quadrupled. I assume you'll be making your mortgage payment?" Silas reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a heavy pouch of gold eagles, his last hidden reserve, which he had planned to use to flee the state. He tossed it to Pendleton. "Paid in full, Horace." Boone sat on his horse, trembling with impotent rage. His dam was useless. His water was gone. His leverage was destroyed. Without a word, he yanked his horse around and galloped off, his hired men trailing behind in quiet defeat. The sheriff and the banker soon departed, leaving Silas and Josie alone in the yard, the symphony of the flowing river echoing around them. Silas turned to the woman who had arrived with 4 heavy trunks and a mountain of secrets. Silas pulled Josie close, the roar of the newborn river echoing around them. He brushed a streak of soot from her cheek, his rough thumb lingering on her skin. She wasn't the simple farmhand he had ordered, but she was the fierce, brilliant partner he desperately needed. The broken spur was saved. As the Texas sun crested the horizon, their shared future flowed as deep and untamed as the water.